Welcome to the iRight Radio videocast and podcast, and it's obviously Hat Friday because I'm wearing a hat. My name's Stuart Lockhead. With me today, as usual, is my buddy, Norman Stewart. How are you doing, Norrie?
Not too bad. I couldn't reach my hat today.
That's fair enough.
So I did think about it. But
We've never punished Envy for not wearing a hat yet.
No. Well, unfortunately, I can't get my arm high enough these days. And my wife hung it up, so I couldn't reach any of my hats, in fact.
All right. Today, the press briefing was quite interesting. Fridays quite often is dull. The First Minister herself was there. We'll have a wee word of that. Norrie and I are still debating politely the issues surrounding the possible conspiracy against Alex Salmond. And we have an interesting take on Boris Johnson and his original time spent in Brussels. Did you know he went to school in Brussels? Bet you didn't know that.
I knew his father had worked for the EU at one point.
Yes, I didn't know that either.
But I didn't know he'd actually gone to the European school.
No, that should be fun. So what did you think of the press of today, Norrie?
I was a bit surprised not to see Jean Freeman there, to be honest, because I thought there was a good chance that I think it was the BBC mostly online plastered the care home situation all over the place. There's been a lot of deaths in care homes recently, in two care homes, both of which I think are Aberdeenshire. So I was expecting that to come up. And I kind of thought she might have brought Jean Freeman along to outline exactly what measures had been put in place. It's that catch-22 for the Scottish government. I mean, if you remember last week, there was a lot of pressure being applied to try and do something about visiting in care homes. So I'd be kind of interested to see whether visiting had been allowed in these particular care homes.
I'm allowed to use the expression damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point I was going to make. The Scottish government, as I say, were getting harassed last week about not opening up care homes to visitors, and they're getting damned this week because there's been infections raging through a couple of care homes. I still think when all this comes out in the wash, that we will not be surprised to find that some care homes have been a bit more slipshod about putting protections in place than others. And something I talked about back in the day when this first became an issue, care homes are not hospital wards. It's much more difficult to isolate people than it is in a medical environment.
The First Minister herself she's obviously been answering similar questions about problems with care homes for 9 months now. She pointed out that that's where an awful lot of the over 80s live, and these are the most vulnerable people in society, plus that they tend to be towards the end of their lives. But also it's communal living, and then plus what you've just said, there are factors. These three factors all add up to what can you do?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if it happened in Scotland, but certainly in England, there were care homes where the staff stayed at the care home. They didn't go home after their shift.
All right.
And that seems to have worked quite successfully, which would suggest that, especially with the, the non-symptomatic, asymptomatic shedding of the virus, we might find that, through no fault of their own, that staff and possibly deliveries have played quite a major part in it.
I'm sure there are a lot of, not sure what they're called, supported accommodation as a broader term. There's a lot of supported accommodation where when staff come in to do a shift, they stay overnight.
Yeah. I mean, the fact is that the vulnerable who need care even if that's somebody coming in to help you shower in the morning, have got to be at really high risk. I mean, they're vulnerable anyway. They tend to be elderly, and they've got people coming in off the street who have been at other vulnerable elderly people's residence. And how do you prevent that spread? You isolate the person. Do you have a carer per person? You know, the cost would be humongous. Almost an impossible circle to square.
There was one announcement at the start of the presser, which was on the news 10 minutes before the presser started, which is a UK4, which is my shorthand for, what do they actually call it? A Four Nations Agreement of the Chief Medical Officers.
I'm a bit surprised at that, actually.
I think that I was surprised at that, especially just before we're expecting a third wave after Christmas. And they're going to reduce the quarantine period. This is my shorthand for things. The quarantine period, if you self-isolate or if you come in from abroad, from 14 days to 10 days.
I can only presume that they've got really good evidence that you can clear yourself of the virus in 10 days. It's a massive step to take if they don't.
And what about the fact that the virus is almost out of control in Wales? I can't imagine the Wales Health Secretary being happy about this.
I mean, the Wales were doing good with their lockdown. Then they came out of their lockdown, almost 3 weeks ago, and look where they are now. It's actually really quite scary because there seems to be a level of interaction in the community that just kicks it off again. And they don't seem to be able to get that level pinned down.
Well, bearing that in mind, I'm asking for a friend here. Judging by what the First Minister said about the levels, the general, what she said generally about the 16 local authority areas coming out of the levels, it doesn't sound as though Edinburgh is going to be any change.
Well, from what she said, I think what I said yesterday has been vindicated, that their worry is not about Edinburgh itself, it's about people travelling in and out of Edinburgh to shop.
Look, and me, what did I say? The First Minister herself said today, you shouldn't travel from West Lothian into Edinburgh.
Well, the Lothians. I mean, yeah, and it's eminently sensible if you're prepared to think about it that way. You know, I don't have an iron in this fire. You know, I'm retired, or what little work I do is online. So I don't have to move. I don't have to go over the door to make money. The likes of our good friend James, who drives a taxi, you know, his pocket has been emptied by this. And that'll apply to an awful lot of people. Mm-hmm. But I want at some point Nicola Sturgeon to stand up at FMQs when they start banging on about visitors to care homes and opening shops and hospitality being opened up, for her to turn around and say, okay, you tell me what level of deaths is acceptable to do this.
She'll not say that.
No, she won't. But that's the question. That's the questions the press can ask.
Yeah. What was interesting about today's presser today was the presence of the Chief Constable, was it not?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm presuming these are going to come to a finish fairly soon. I don't know if she's going to keep the daily press briefings going. But I think that was just his opportunity to say to everybody, didn't be daft at Christmas.
Normally they wheel him out anyway, don't they?
Yeah, well, he did his...
don't drink and drive.
Don't drink and drug drive.
Don't drink and drug drive, right.
Which is, I don't think I've heard that said quite as explicitly before.
You know, Scotland's been behind the rest of the UK in testing for drug driving. I know it's been They do now, but I think they've been last.
That's
in the
because
UK.
we don't take drugs up here.
Obviously not. Portobello Beach got a mention by the Chief Constable and Loch
Aye.
Lomond. So you know where not to go, because that's where the police will be checking out.
Go to the secret beach.
there
And before
was-
anybody asks, we're not telling you where it
we're
is.
not telling you where it is. I thought the Tron might have got a mention because the question was asked whether people would be gathering on the streets, and the Chief Constable did admit, yes, people normally meet on the streets at Hogmanay, and
I was wondering, you can still get to the Tron.
that's not. How do they stop people getting to the Tron? How do they stop people getting to George Square in Glasgow? You know?
You just can't walk over Princess Street to get there
Oh, that's normally when the
when they
street
shut
parties.
it down. Yeah.
I'm not a fan of that old nonsense. Mind you, I can remember the days. That's another story.
I enjoyed the early days of it, not so much now.
Should we tell? I think we should tell people about. We were the Chief Constable gave us a very quick summary of his policing policy.
Well, if you, I've got a wee anecdote for this. My wife popped in. She was doing a visit and she popped in from work, just in time for the chap from the Times to ask the question. So Nicola said, "Okay, guy from the Times, your question." Just as Jill sat down, and I said, "This will be a stupid question. You take it from there, Stuart."
Well, the question was about police finances. Now, this is a COVID briefing. Police finances. Have you got enough money to cover all your extra expenses? Have you the detail of this question? Have you got enough money to fund it all? This was also in the same question to ask the First Minister, have you got enough money to fund all your plans? Have you got enough? Are you going to refund students for the university fees? Are you going to refund NHS staff for their call charges? And the First Minister said, what did she say? I'm not holding
budget negotiations. I mean, you could have summed it up really simply by saying, he asked the Chief Constable to ask the First Minister for money, and then asked the First Minister if she would guarantee giving the Chief Constable the money he asked for. I mean, this is the Times.
Yeah, give him credit for trying.
Well, I mean, seriously.
We've got used to this fella, Mark McLaughlin. He turns out to be he gets 10 out of 10 most days for the stupidity of his questions, but I give him 10 out of 10 for trying.
But he's also the one that tries to use COVID to hook something else onto. Today's an example of that, the police budget. COVID allowed him to say, well, the fact it was the COVID briefing allowed him to say, have you got enough money to cover the extra expense of COVID? But what I really want to know is, will you two openly argue about budgets in front of the cameras for me, please?
But look, we've spoken about this before, how these daily press briefings have given us a window into the world of the Scottish journalists, the Scottish press. We've learned a huge amount about them. But there's something else I don't think we've possibly mentioned up to now. I'm sure somebody like Mark McLaughlin, they're almost all young journalists, are thinking about, well, I'm exposed on television so many days a week. This is my chance to further my career.
Well, by asking stupid questions.
Well, it may be stupid in the real world, but as far as getting a job at the Sun or the Star or the Daily Mail, that's what they probably expect journalists to say.
Well, I mean, I think a fun game would actually, one day we should do it. We should the whole program should be about the briefing. And what we should do is, when each question's asked, come up with the headline that's going to appear the next day.
Oh, I'm quite happy to play that game.
Because I'm convinced they've already written the piece and the headline is sitting waiting to be decided upon. And that's what the question refers to. So I fully expect to see in the Times today or tomorrow a headline, police budget inadequate for COVID. or Scottish government refuses to guarantee extra money for COVID cover by
Well,
police.
Yeah, but what he should say, and what he probably will say, is what the Chief Constable himself said, because the Chief Constable told us that when he first started policing, he used to knock on the doors of the lawyers and accountants around Charlotte Square in Edinburgh, checking their back doors to make sure they hadn't been broken into. But nowadays, these same people are worried about ransomware attacks in the online world. And also people are more concerned generally about their private spaces. The streets are no longer where most crime is committed.
Well,
But
I can already see the bad SNP story here. Not enough police on the street because they're wasting their time fighting cybercrime.
they're wasting their time. You think so?
Fighting cybercrime. How many police have you got sitting in offices on computers?
Well, there you go.
Why aren't they out in the street battling the drug-crazed hordes that don't vote Tory?
But then in the end, the Chief Constable did fall for the trap, you could say, of the journal, Mark McLaughlin's trap, because he did respond in the end. The last thing he said in public was, "I have a low tolerance of staff reductions. I intend to retain our staff." That, I'm pretty sure that was a message, a public message to the First Minister. Don't cut our budget. We need our staff.
I would doubt very much that the Scottish Government will be cutting the police budget. Well, it might well depend on Barnett Consequentials, what comes out of London. But as I say, which actually brings me neatly on to the internal market bill and the money that the UK government intends to spend in Scotland on Scotland's behalf without the Scottish government's input.
All right.
That might affect the police budget.
Oh yeah, that we're going to be covering a lot more of that, especially I think in January.
Well,
are they going to bare their teeth in January? I suppose they are, aren't they?
Well, one of our watchers, I think you forwarded it to me, a comment he made, which I know nothing about. The comment involved, what was it? Something about Gove unilaterally changing the where is it?
Is this the one from Ina? Gove plans to modernise the constitution unilaterally. Yes, no, I did see that headline somewhere. I haven't read the detail on that yet, so I can't really widen the topic. No, thanks, Ina, for your comments. What does he say? Yeah, he says this is talking about the £500 offered to Frontline. But that's a different issue. But yes, Gove plans to modernise the constitution unilaterally. I have no other information on that. I'm glad you brought it up, Ina, and we will cover that in the future.
We'll delve into it. But the point I was going to make was that any change to the constitution that goes against the Treaty of Union is still breaking a treaty. It doesn't have to touch the Treaty of Union to break it.
I think this is where essentially Peter Abel has been right, just like Stuart Campbell has been right. In the end, we're going to have to get our freedom, our independence through the Treaty of Union, not through some permission from Westminster.
And Norrie Stewart was right as well. That's basically what I've been arguing for years. But the minute he does that, there should be a delegation, a letter sent to Boris Johnson saying, well, as soon as you're changing the constitutional settlement, we want to renegotiate the Treaty of Union. And if you're not prepared to do that, we'll be leaving. See you later, pal.
Right, shall we have an argument now, or shall we leave that for last?
Well, no, let's just go and get this over and done with.
Right. We have, of course, the ongoing saga of the harassment inquiry. And the latest top of the latest headline this week has really been the First Minister's husband, Peter Murrell, and his appearance as a witness. The detail, not sure. I think Iain Lawson is possibly the best summary of what's happened this week. What do you think, Norrie?
I think it's naive. What was the actual heading of Lawson's piece?
The odd couple.
Right. Now, I wanted to discuss this because I want to ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to imagine that you're the leader of the Tory party in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
You're on the hustings and you ask for questions from the audience. And I say to you, should you win the election and become the First Minister of Scotland, you will be on the Privy Council. Will you discuss Privy Council business with your wife? So, will you discuss Privy Council business with your wife?
Probably, yes.
Right. Well, you can't be on the Privy Council then.
I don't think anybody is expected to be a saint to be on the Privy Council.
You can't be on the Privy Council. If you go to a COBRA meeting to discuss some military emergency, will you discuss the contents of that meeting with your wife?
Well, I'm going to ask you to think back to, say, Mrs. Thatcher's day when they described her style of government. She had a kitchen cabinet. Now, your kitchen, I can't imagine her kitchen was that big. So who was included in her kitchen cabinet? And did she not share defence secrets, Privy Council secrets to that kitchen cabinet? And would that have included Dennis, her husband?
You're talking about the Prime Minister of Great Britain. I'm talking about the First Minister of Scotland. At the moment, those are two different jobs. Now, I want you to tell me whether, if you're going to be First Minister of Scotland, you can be fit for the job if you include your spouse in what is state secrets.
Well, I've given you my answer on that one. Can I point out that the main target, although the headline on Iain Lawson's article is the odd couple and the photograph is of Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Murrell, I think his main target is the paragraph where he targets Leslie Evans. He feels that her position looks increasingly vulnerable. What do you think about that?
I think she's more likely to go than Peter Murrell.
He says here, the evidence of the most recent witnesses gives her a much more central and decisive role than her own evidence suggested. There is already no possibility that her evidence and the evidence of the more recent witnesses can both be true.
Well, I think a bigger issue here is the fact it wasn't disclosed to the defence in the Salmond trial that she'd met with them and knew who they were before she went ahead with the investigation. I think she might have broken the law there.
It seemed to, it seems that, I don't know how, if you don't produce evidence which a court order demands you produce, and then it's found later on, is that not at least some contempt of court?
I would think so. And I have to say, that's the way I'm thinking, is that, I mean, remember there was a search ordered by the court for all relevant details.
Yes, now that was a very rare type of hearing called a commission of diligence. And this is where it all fell down for the, if there are conspirators, this is where it all fell apart, because the court at the judicial review, is that what it was called? In front of the judge anyway, it was a civil action by Salmond. And this is where it all came out. This commission of diligence, it's a very rare hearing, and so you could say the Scottish government officials were not expecting such penetrating questions to be asked of them, I think, and such
Well,
evidence to be required to be shown.
I think there's a serious stumbling block there, because withholding evidence from the defence is a serious accusation, and it looks like the minutes of said meetings, if they exist, weren't forwarded. I think the comment I saw was the case would have fallen apart on those grounds alone.
Very true. I think there's a quote here, which this is more a general. This is back to Iain Lawson, and this is more about what needs to happen now urgently. He says, the Scottish government must release all the requested papers, including the legal advice. If these papers, that's the legal advice that was apparently ignored, we think. If these papers are widely expected to reveal that the Scottish government were advised that their moves would be rejected by the judge, but despite this, the Scottish government still determined to proceed in a move, and this is where it gets controversial, in a move designed to expose Alex Salmond to public ridicule, using a great deal of public money to do so, then that should be admitted, and those responsible for that decision, all of them, should be named and their identities made public. Now that's a serious accusation, is it not?
Do we know who was giving this advice?
The legal advice. It's the Chancellor, or no, the Lord Advocate. It's James Wolfe.
Who has an axe to grind in all this?
Well, he's already been in trouble with
So let's not presume the worst of this. Let's presume that Mr. Wolfe was grinding his axe when he was giving the advice. Which gets the Scottish government off the hook, but puts the Crown Office on the hook, which means you have the head of the civil service in Scotland and the Crown Office potentially the ones whose heads are going to roll.
Well, that would suit the independence movement, wouldn't it?
I find it very difficult to believe that a protege of Alex Salmond, i.e. Nicola Sturgeon, didn't learn enough of, because he played politics really well, didn't learn enough of Salmond not to be involved in this. I mean, if this seriously was an organized effort, it shows incompetence of a magnitude almost unbelievable.
Right. We know that you could be right. We know that Liz Lloyd, this is Nicola Sturgeon's Chief of Staff, Liz Lloyd, she got, since this affair came out, she's got a raise and promotion, a double level raise in her salary. We know that Leslie Evans, the permanent secretary, since this affair started, got an extension of her contract. Now, these are both suspicious acts. They're like, I've got to be careful what I say here. But who would authorize both these? It would be the First Minister would be forced to authorize these. I don't
think the First Minister is. I think the civil service is apart from the Scottish government on this one.
Well, Liz Lloyd,
pay scales, etc.
Liz Lloyd's paid by the SNP.
Yeah, well, but I'm saying, sorry, Evans.
Leslie Evans is a different.
Separate.
But she couldn't have extended her contract herself. Would that have been extended from London?
Yeah. It's a civil service pay scale, I presume. I don't think it's a different setup north of the border. These are British civil servants.
And of course, the moment you mention that, you're faced with the question, all along, has Leslie Evans been answerable to London, to her boss in London? Have they been pulling the strings?
That's the next question. So, you know, it, I mean, you love your conspiracy theories, Stuart. So I've just handed you one. What if this
You
is
can
all driven from London?
you can call them conspiracy theories if you like. I've read people like John le Carre ever since his first book, and other writers, that fellow West, Nigel West, people who've actually worked inside our secret services. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to realize this sort of thing goes on.
Well, as I say, but I've given you another leg there. What if Leslie Evans' strings are not being pulled from Holyrood, but they're being pulled from Westminster? Nobody seems to have thought that's a possibility.
Oh, I have. I'm sure we've discussed this, but let me finish up with, I've got one other quote from Iain Lawson's little piece here. He says, "I have no worries for Alex, but I am concerned that the way this is already going, Nicola could end up in an even more serious and difficult position than she already is. At the moment, the Scottish government appear to be a bunch of conniving desperados engaged in the futile concealment of their dealings in this matter. Worse, they are really not very good at it." Now, that falls into what you're saying.
Well,
Nicola's one of them. She didn't learn from Alex.
I'm amazed at the incompetence. I mean, one of the problems with these Machiavellian moves is there is no way you can foretell the direction they will take. You
Aye.
just need one person to take it too far, one person to be too honest, one person who believes the rules are not bendable, you know, and all of a sudden, a complaint that's supposed to smear somebody becomes a court case.
Well, look, last
You
week,
know?
was that a fortnight ago, Kenny McCaskill was on a podcast, and I heard him say, he said, "I know these civil servants personally. I work with these. Don't forget, he was in the Scottish government he was in the Justice Department. He says, I know these civil servants that are named, you know, and possibly involved in this conspiracy, and they're not stupid." And 3 days later, James Summers turns up as a witness at the inquiry, and first of all, he said he's the principal private secretary to the First Minister. He admitted meeting the first Jigsaw women at a time. He's in charge of 150 senior staff at the Scottish government, and he came across as extremely competent. So I immediately thought of Kenny McCaskill's description of these senior civil servants, and they don't make mistakes, said Kenny McCaskill. So then,
Well,
if they're not making mistakes, then it is a conspiracy.
Well, the least competent looking of the civil servants I've seen were Leslie Evans and the HR woman,
Judith McKinnon.
Judith McKinnon.
Now, she's the one that came from Police Scotland.
Well, they have been the least competent. Now, whether they are, in fact, incompetent, or they look that way because they had secrets to hide, who knows? I mean, you won't know. I look forward to McKinnon's book.
Should we finish off with a bit of fun roasting Boris?
Yes, okay. You take the lead on this one, Stuart. You've got some perverse enjoyment.
Yes, I do.
Out of this.
Yes, it's by Mark Landler. I'm not sure where he's comes from, but he works for the New York Times. He's the bureau chief in London, their European bureau chief. He's worked all over the world. He's a very senior writer. He's written today in the New York Times about Boris. Boris once mocked the bureaucrats of Brussels. They haven't forgotten.
Well, his career as a journalist in Brussels seems to be most remembered for the lies he told.
What, the straight banana?
Yeah, the bendy banana, and I was there not something about manure as well?
Oh yes, the smell of manure.
There was to be a sniff test for manure.
Yes, Was that for the quality of the manure? I don't know. But decades ago, he made plenty of enemies there with his crazy articles. And now those officials may determine his political fate.
Well, I think maybe the kind of nugget in there for me was the fact that Boris did not build a network when he was in Europe. So he doesn't have friends scattered through the civil service in Europe. He kind of seems to be, he kind of turned up and then went home without creating any friendships.
I didn't realize that his father, Stanley, worked at the commission there.
I knew this. I don't know. I can't remember when I picked it up, but I remember thinking right at the start of Brexit that this would come out in the papers. There would be a headline: Boris Johnson's father lives off a pension from the European Union, something like that. Because I think he actually worked. He wasn't working in Europe. He worked for the commission.
He worked for the commission,
and he'll get a pension out of that.
Yeah, and we discovered in this article, which I didn't know before, presumably other people did, that Boris actually went to school in Brussels.
Ah, yes. There's a nice twist to this story.
Yeah, you're going to tell them.
Well, apparently von der Leyen and Boris both went to the European school. Boris made the comment that they'd been at school together. Von der Leyen pointed out they were at the same school, but at different times. So she didn't want to be associated with him at all on that one.
No, and apparently we saw it. We saw on television last night or yesterday when they were over there. If you've seen the coverage of his visit to Brussels, you'll have seen them standing in front of the flags and
for the photo op.
And he looks like Wurzel Gummidge, and she's just standing there being a businesslike. But apparently, before they walked off, apparently Boris said, "You run a tight ship here, Ursula," he said when she ordered him to put on a mask after posing for cameras. It reminds me of the time that he tried to get one-upmanship with Nicola going in the door of Butte House. Remember that?
Yeah, when he tried to usher her through the door first, like he owned it.
And she wasn't having it.
Well, what you can actually hear the sound when they turn up for the photo op. Von der Leyen tells him to keep his distance.
That's true.
And he then asks her, "Is mask on, mask off?" And she says, "Mask off for the pictures," and then tells him to put his mask back on. Maybe he's into that. Maybe he likes a strong woman telling him what to do.
Yes, well, I think that's probably true. I quite like a strong woman, but we'll leave it. I'm perhaps giving away too much here.
It doesn't matter what I like.
Okay.
I just get told what you do.
You get told anyway. I didn't realize it's been 25 years at least since he worked at Brussels. The old Boris. He left in 1994. He's not been back very much since.
Well, that was kind of the bit I picked up on, as I say.
There's not much of a network.
Was the fact that he didn't have a lot of pals there. And it'll be like any political bubble. If you're not in it, you don't really know what's going on, be it Westminster or Brussels or Edinburgh.
I think his negotiating skills are under attack as well. Somebody that knew him, a former senior official at the European Commission who was worked there with Johnson back in the day, setting up sovereignty as the issue and interpreting the result of the referendum as a mandate for no interference is not the way the world works, unless you want to be North Korea.
Yeah. I think a couple of the slogans, when we look back on this, there's going to be a couple of the slogans that have actually caused a lot more bother than they should have. Get Brexit done. The side of the bus stuff. It'll come back to haunt them. And my fear is that the Brexiteers are not forced to own this. They're going to try and blame everybody else. And I can't see our press being up. I noticed that Joe Coburn now refers to no deal as the Australia-style deal.
Oh, don't even go there. This is the trouble. They sit there in number 10 and they work, people like Dominic Cummings and his team, they work out language and communications and how they can twist things. And they calling it an Australia deal is it's a no deal.
But as I say, Joe Coburn of the BBC is now referring to it as an Australian style deal. And the other one, of course, is NHS track and trace.
Yeah. No, they're at it all the time.
Shocking.
Well, the messaging and the language used. The last time we had a big crisis was the banking crisis, 2009. And of course, the expression that did end up being used was banksters, gangster bankers, banksters. Now you know my opinion on behavior and when you can genuinely call somebody a gangster. Basically, if you bully somebody in the school playground and the person gives in, that means the bully knows the next time that you'll give in every time. And that is the definition of a gangster. The quote here from Mr. Lander is here. Boris Johnson, this describes the way they're trying to negotiate with Brussels, these brexiteers. Boris Johnson and some of those around him genuinely believe that if you are very tough and push hard enough, then the EU will cave in. They just behave like gangsters.
Well, the British have a political strategy for that. Back in the day, it was called gunboat diplomacy. You just send your gunboats to sit off the capital coast.
Well, the big question, the elephant in the room to me is the City of London and the fact that it's the financial capital of Europe. The question is it vulnerable? Who can use it as a weapon? Is it the Brexiteers or is it the EU?
I don't think either side has enough control over it to use it as a weapon. The City of London will do what the City of London needs to do. Yeah, if it needs to move to Frankfurt, that's what it will do.
That's the thing. But I mean, the point is, I don't think they will. Don't forget that an awful lot of people believe that the main driving force of Brexit is because the European Union decided to take control of all the money laundering done in Europe.
Well, all the money laundering done in Europe was done in London.
Yes.
So they're just going to move that to Dublin and Paris and Frankfurt.
No. The EU have brought it in 2018. Controls on.
It's just been ratified.
Okay, just been ratified, but it went through the Parliament there, I think, 2018, and that, according to many people, was the motivation, the desperate motivation by all these hedge funds, etc., to get Britain out of the EU.
We might be talking about two different things here. I'm talking about the charge that the EU are going to bring in on deals. So each deal you do, there's a tax on it, basically. Oh, no, London never wanted that.
I'm talking about regulations. The British government were never going to regulate.
I'm horrified. Regulate the financial sector?
Yes.
Oh my God, the whole world will collapse.
What was that? At first, the City of London got rich. It happened in Thatcher's day, didn't it? What did they call it when they deregulated?
Deregulation.
No, they had a word for it, an expression for it that day. Anyway, yes, they deregulated. They just.
Was it not cutting red tape?
Yeah, well, no, it was a snappier. We're both old here. Neither of us can think of the snappy term. Anyway, that was the argument. So how do you think? How did it go today? I think we've covered quite a bit of ground. What do you think?
I think that'll do us.
And thank you all for listening and watching. And do you like my bonnet?
Aye,
See,
aye.
it's not quite a Peaky Blinders one. I think I need to get a Peaky Blinders one now.
You're too old.
Okay. Cheerio.